to the Crystal Tablet Podcast, a podcast where we talk about the intersections between politics and spirituality. Um, so far, I'm kind of like, are we doing that? Because what is that? And I think that that is an episode that I think I mentioned a few things about it in the introduction, but I think we'll kind of come back to, what are the intersections of politics and spirituality, and what is politics and what is spirituality? Because I think that having some like a working definition of what those things mean, at least when we're talking about it, because I think there's a certain level of give and take, and we define these big words in all kinds of different ways. I think that's something that I would love to come back to and kind of revisit, because it is really important. But for today's episode, one of the things that we're going to be touching upon is something that, for me, when I think about the intersections of politics and spirituality, it's kind of been on my mind for 4 or 5 years, as I've been thinking about why this podcast is significant, why I think it's important, why are these the conversations that I think are significant to have rather than something else. So kind of building a clear case for why that is something that I feel like I'm always reflecting on, seeing if anything has changed, seeing new things that appear. And for me, one of the biggest ones for me is substance use, drugs, which is inclusive but not limited to psychedelics. And I feel like that's one place where I think there's a lot of interesting conversations to be had. I know, Leila, you definitely are involved more directly than I am at this point in sort of the world of psychedelics. I am, I know that it's something that is a big part of my life and has, the viewpoint keeps changing, and I'd like to think that it's evolving, or I hope that it is. And so I guess, I think this is I guess I wanted to start off with kind of like from the pulpit, so to speak, kind of getting in my soapbox for just a few minutes to kind of like express some of the kind of general ideas that I think are significant. So it's kind of like going to be a very short form sort of video essay to kind of get the conversation started, just kind of like lay the groundwork for just how I look at this. And I'd love to kind of get some feedback, and then we'll kind of see what comes up for each of us and go from there. But basically, the way that I look at it is that I think we can all acknowledge that substances play a really big role in human history. We can look at things like Terence McKenna's whole stoned ape theory, which I think is nice as an argument. I don't personally put a lot of stock into it, but I think it's significant insofar as it validates substance use as being transformative and having potential, and so it casts it in a positive light. Do I think that that's factually the case? No, but I think that it's a nice. It rehabilitates the idea of substance use as being significant and something that is positive, which I think is kind of where I'm ultimately headed with this whole thing. But I think that, there's examples like that where we can look back into the kind of the annals of human history and recognize that substance use is like a pretty big part of our species. And I think that kind of gets lost. There's been such a kind of a prohibitionist kind of paradigm that a lot of that basic sort of anthropological top level context really kind of gets thrown out the window when we're talking about drugs, because drugs is this whole new category that exists sort of like theoretically in people's minds in a way that feels separate from that. And often that context just doesn't exist because people don't necessarily, take a deep dive into like, well, did people use drugs like 5,000 years ago? Like, that's not always where people are first going to look. It's like something that you might, come across if you take a more serious approach. And I really want to watch it because it's super relevant right now, but Michael Pollan's Netflix series, it's something that I want to go and look and I think that I have a lot of regard for his approach. I'm also extremely critical of certain things that Michael Pollan has done and said, and I think that in some ways I think his influence is really toxic, and in other ways I think it's really transformative. And so it's kind of like I want to go and take a look at the series, and I feel like a lot of what I'm saying is probably has a lot of basis, and you can look to the series because I think he goes into a deep dive with a lot of these different things. But before I get too tangential, the point here is to kind of bring it back to the drug conversation where we are today. Broadly speaking, there's kind of been this really kind of anti-drug, war on drugs, Ronald Reagan, drugs are bad, don't do any drugs. That's kind of like, I think, the paradigm that most people have been influenced by, inherited, we're stuck being around. It's kind of, the sort of drug war has been exported globally from the United States to pretty much the entire world. And so that's kind of, I think the baseline is this kind of like drugs are bad, categorically, they're gonna, fry your brains and there's something that needs to be avoided, despite the fact that drugs are inclusive of caffeine and alcohol, and that didn't seem to make the cut for, it's the complete contradictions as far as like the words having meanings that are intelligible and the way that people understand it is so completely muddled, where I think that it's almost impossible to have a conversation using terms that are even meaningful, because if you're saying a drug but you're not talking about alcohol, and alcohol, it's been studied, is probably the most destructive, if not one of the most destructive drugs, even compared to things like methamphetamine and heroin, etc. There's just kind of such a complete sort of really total confusion around when we say things. Are we saying things that have any meaning that makes any sense, or is it just whatever prejudice you're speaking from? And I find that to be true almost everywhere when people are thinking about drugs and talking about them. So even deconstructing the labels is just a whole deep dive in of itself. But again, I think just trying to keep it really focused and not too tangential, because there's a lot to unpack. I think that the summary that I'm trying to kind of convey is just that, the drug war prohibitionist paradigm is kind of what we're all looking at as kind of like, that's the primary thing. There's the 60s counterculture, which I think is kind of coming up a lot in terms of how psychedelics are kind of making their way back into the public eye and the collective consciousness, what have you, which I think that's kind of parallel. But for me, I think when we're talking about drugs more generally, the biggest and most significant response to the prohibitionist paradigm has been what you're probably familiar with, harm reduction. And so harm reduction, as I'm sure many people are aware, but I'll just kind of give my very brief summary. I am no expert in harm reduction, but I feel I can kind of give like a 3 or 4 sentence explanation. First, harm reduction is recognizing that people will do drugs, and that if as care workers or whatever role you're in, your interest is in helping that person and ensuring their well-being, there are things that we can do to make drug use less dangerous. And so, syringe exchanges and education and, all kinds of things. Drug testing is a big part of that. So harm reduction is generally the model that has been more and more employed as we've seen some genuine drug reform. I think harm reduction is at the core of, Portugal decriminalized all drugs in 2000. And that's really been kind of a pioneer situation in terms of just like showing that, when you decriminalize drugs, it's not like society crumbles. In fact, it's a much more humane and practical answer to the fact that people will use drugs, and some of those people will need help, and some of those people will be functional drug users, and that's a much more specific conversation. Suffice to say, of course, in Oregon, that's the closest thing we have here in the United States to a similar paradigm shift, but it's all built around, not completely, but predominantly around the idea of harm reduction, right? So to me, when we're talking about drugs, right, we primarily have the prohibitionist paradigm. We have the harm reduction model, which is very functional, very practical, very compassionate. I am a big supporter of it. To me, it doesn't go far enough, and I'll explain why in a second. And then next to that, we have the sort of like shamanic, spiritually influenced, seeking transformation and healing thread, which is LSD. It's the arrival of psilocybin into the United States through R. Gordon Wasson, Maria Sabina, the kind of arrival of ayahuasca, ibogaine, all these kinds of things, the kind of psychedelic model, which is much more driven by theft or borrowing or taking from, or sometimes genuinely celebrating indigenous communities and their ways of engaging with these plant medicines, which is a whole conversation in and of itself. To me, they're all the same thing. And I think sometimes people who advocate for psychedelics want to make this artificial separation between, we have psychedelics over here and all those other bad drugs over there. And so that it's called psychedelic exceptionalism, and it's generally the idea that psychedelics are healing and good and allow us to overcome the bad addiction. So for example, if someone takes psilocybin and they were an alcoholic and that helps them with their alcoholism, psilocybin good, alcohol bad, right? So there's this kind of moral good, bad labeling of different substances that is often cast through this kind of psychedelic lens, which is psychedelic exceptionalism. So I kind of feel like when I've looked at how people are addressing substance use overall, when you think about like rehab, that's kind of not really harm reduction, but it's sort of like it's in the same general kind of, someone is addicted, they have an addiction problem and they need help. So I feel like, of course, that's not conclusive. It's not everything. I'm sure there's a lot of other models that I'm not speaking to. But to me, just having looked at this conversation for quite a long time, I feel like those are the biggest those are the monoliths that I encountered. There's like drugs bad, prohibition, people will do drugs. How can we help them? Drugs are still bad in our view, but let's make them not be as harmful, harm reduction. And then some drugs are really amazing and special and can allow us to evolve and grow and transform. And you need to know about it. And maybe it can help with your PTSD and all these other things. And that's the sort of psychedelic enthusiasm, which is usually framed within psychedelics are somehow different than other drugs. So those are the three kinds of things that I feel like I would love to eventually have guests talk about this kind of substance subject, because I think it's really, really, for me, extremely important to my own personal life. And I feel like when I think about politics and spirituality, drugs are right there as like one of the biggest topics that really kind of scream like this is where these two things converge, because my spirituality has been deeply informed by drug use. And I feel like when we look at legislation, policies, how drugs are approached by governments, that's a very, very blatantly political issue, as we see with kind of like cannabis reform and so on and so forth, and decriminalized nature, which is, one of the movements that's kind of been, making a lot of impact in terms of especially plant medicine. So all of that is kind of my little precursor to trying to wrap up this tangent and not go too long, but I think that all of that is important basis, because I think that if we look at kind of like how are the conversations happening in the world today, that's kind of what's going on. And so what I'm about to say only makes sense in response to what's already out there, which is kind of me saying, hey, to me, this is all completely wrong, inadequate, insufficient, and there's a different model and a better model that I would love to see people adopt, and kind of drawing upon what I find the most inspiring to kind of make that point. So that's kind of what I'm getting to. So this is kind of like the segue into what I think we should be doing instead. And so what I advocate and what I'm kind of developing and trying to find ways to support is what I call the drug celebration paradigm, right? And so what that means is that it's sort of recognizing that when we talk about a prohibitionist model, it's by definition hypocritical, because we're talking about caffeine and alcohol, and those are accepted substances. So to me, the answer is not let's ban caffeine and alcohol. The answer is maybe the way that we're thinking about substances is kind of limited, and it's obvious that we can have positive relationships with substances. I know that there's clearly some boundaries to how much coffee is good for me, but overall, I enjoy coffee. I think it's good. I drink coffee today. I think that's something that we can clearly see. It's totally possible to have a constructive, healthy, moderate, not troubling relationship to a substance. And to me, that logic is true for every single substance, but there is certainly levels of safety, maturity, self-awareness, all kinds of things that play a factor. Of course, there are clearly substances out there that are much more dangerous than coffee is. And so it's not kind of trying to defy reality, but rather say that, hey, maybe these categories are not what we think they are. So that's one part of it. It's kind of partially the critique of the prohibitionist model. The critique of the harm reduction model is primarily the the basis of harm reduction is that substance use is harmful. And it's like, well, no, it's not. Like, it can be, but that's a stigmatizing framing of the person as you're a user of a substance and there's something wrong with you. It's like, well, do I have a disease because I'm a caffeine addict, right? Like, according to that model, then yeah, if I drink alcohol, it's kind of, I think the double standards I think apply again. So I think the intent is really good, but there's a sort of a condemnation of the act of taking a substance, and it's kind of like in light of human society. And we've been making alcohol for, I think, an incredibly long time. It's like people have wanted to get intoxicated. People want to get high. And so for me, the idea that you care about someone using this harm reduction paradigm, but there's a sort of a structural rejection of the basis. Sorry, let me rephrase that. There's a structural rejection of what I think is fundamental to just being alive, is that we want to feel good. Getting high is a way to feel good. Does it have some dangers and risks? Absolutely. But that's just, to me, not a reason to be dismissive. And so when I think about why people do drugs, a lot of it has to do with like, it makes me feel good. I want to get high. And the idea that we think there's something wrong with that, to me, is really deeply troubling. It's like, well, you want to stop someone from pursuing happiness? Because that's a lot of times what I think people are craving and needing, especially when you get to these more extreme kinds of addictions, especially with heroin and fentanyl. It's like you're trying to feel okay. And that's what you have in front of you because nothing else is working. So to take that away just to me seems very cruel. That's not what harm reduction is trying to do, but I think that there's still this kind of like idea that sobriety is somehow better than not sobriety. And I really contest that. And I think it's a very troubling premise, though harm reduction has done a lot of good. Finally, with the psychedelic criticism and why, for me, the drug celebration paradigm is such an improvement is that I, have a lot of respect for psychedelics, but I think that the idea that psychedelics are inherently different is something that I really contest. And part of that is because I've done a lot of psychedelics, starting when I was, I think, 16 and to the present. So I've had 16 years of taking drugs that are psychedelic, not all the time, but I feel like I've kind of, I've run the gamut of having a wide range of experiences. And some of my most psychedelic experiences are from drinking a latte and like going to the beach. That's the most like I think about like where my mind goes when I drink like a really high quality, and I'm not trying to wrap like third wave coffee completely, but like when I drink a really good latte and feel that caffeine, I don't know why, but me in particular, I have this crazy psychedelic experience that frankly is as wild as taking something that we classify as psychedelic. And so for me, in my own experience, how am I going to artificially make a delineation between caffeine and, like, let's say psilocybin or LSD or MDMA when I'm having equivalent experiences from coffee? I'm having equivalent experiences sometimes from just alcohol, so it's kind of like I have psychedelic experiences from things that we don't call psychedelic. So for my own experience, these definitions just don't really work. People can adopt them anyway, but they're basically describing something that for me is empirically just not true. That is not my experience. Many of my most psychedelic experiences are also, THC, for example. So it's kind of like when that's happening, it's not just, oh, pot also gets me really high and crazy as well. It's like it's coffee too. It's really, so for me, when that has really kind of sunk in into the way I look at it, to me, drawing these boundaries is not something that I really can buy into. So all of that is sort of like, those are the critiques and why drug celebration is so important to me. The resolution and moving forwards from harm reduction, these delineations, is I think that as the baseline, we should celebrate the fact that people want to get high, right? And start from there. And it's not to disregard that there are real risks. It's not to disregard any of the things that I think people are somewhat aware of, but just kind of starting from a place of not stigmatizing in the first place. The fact that I want to take a substance to alter my state of being is something that to me should be celebrated, because in my own life, it's a testament to my determination to grow, develop, evolve, change as a person, refine myself, become better than I was yesterday. And when I look at my journey over the last more, decade and a half, substances have often served that purpose. Sometimes it hasn't served that purpose. It's not saying it always does, but by and large, I am who I am because drugs made me, right? I made me because I'm a person and I have my experience of my own life, but I wouldn't be anything like who I am today if it wasn't for all the drugs that I did along the way. And I think that just to acknowledge that and say, that's awesome, that's great. It can be destructive, but let's not just go there and only go there. And so a paradigm that emphasizes the positive aspects of taking a substance, whatever it might be, is what I think we need to move towards. And then think about those three other paradigms as sort of like, there are insights there that we need to look at. Regulation, harm reduction doesn't disappear, and psychedelics don't stop being special and significant, and in some ways deserving of a certain kind of like, yeah, they are not the same as other substances, but just let's start from the general principle that it's okay and probably even good that you want to take a substance without disregarding the fact that there are real negative repercussions that can occur. But let's not just only start there. Let's start from what I think is actually more realistic, is that most people have really good connections to the substances that they use, and it can go off the rails like anything else can. But let's talk about what's really going on, which is that people want to get high. I want to get high, And I think that's true for most people. And if you're not getting high through a substance, well, maybe it's something else. It's meditation, whatever. There's so many other ways you can get high. But I think that that would take it to a whole another conversation. I think I've already kind of taken more than I wanted to in terms of just to time wise to kind of convey the groundwork of what I'm talking about. That's pretty much it. It's kind of building on this like the drug celebration paradigm is just kind of the label that I'm using right now, and kind of trying to build on those insights and kind of make it more clear what is being conveyed. That is pretty much my whole video essay about drugs and drug use. So I will. I'm curious to hear any feedback you have or thoughts or what comes to mind, and we can kind of have more of a conversation, and we'll see how we are with time.
Yeah, yeah, that was a lot, but a lot of good things. I try to keep a mental note of all of the things I wanted to mention, but let's see how many I can recall. I think one important topic that you touched on was bodily autonomy, right? Of, why doesn't every human have the right to ingest a drug or sort of have sort of I think what you were alluding to is have rights to their own body. And I think, this is like the idealized version of where we want to be, right? And I think it's really important just to mention that that may not be the case until, women have bodily autonomy. Because as you know, in the US right now, there's a lot of legislation being put to, deprive women of that, to deprive, trans people of that. So I think this is an argument that is a little bit more global than I think we, give it credit to be. It's almost like there's no autonomy until women and trans people have autonomy, and so I think this is like a a more all-encompassing fight than just people who want to use drugs. I think it's really important for anyone to be able to ingest whatever they like, and then and obviously um yeah, I'm a firm believer in that everybody sort of owns their own body. Obviously, if you're a minor, you have parents who are going to be watching out for you, but I think that is like a big conversation that is goes even farther than drugs. But that was just one thing I wanted to mention that I thought was really important. The other thing was I've seen Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind on Netflix. It was fairly well done. I mean, very beautiful, very well made, and informative. Because as you know, I've been working in the psychedelic field for the past 3 years or so, and I would avoid all things psychedelics just because it sort of exploded that everything in my life was just related to psychedelics, and I couldn't even fathom just like having it even more seep into like my all aspects of my life. It was kind of everywhere around me, and so I needed a little break from it. But so I haven't read the book, but it was crazy to me to see the transformation go from, a select few people talking about psychedelics, sort of keeping that almost like an sacred underground, versus like a, sacred above ground. Like, there's like a huge separation in between. And then once, Pollan came in with this book, which I don't think he meant to sort of, uh, revolutionize psychedelics with. I think it just sort of happened organically, but it was just crazy to see this explosion that happened after he came out with it. So I don't necessarily blame him fully. I think he was just somebody that people held in high regard because he's a food writer and he's famous, and people tend to listen to those authority figures that have had a name in the past for something, I don't know, pretty basic. And so I think what happened was, he didn't really write this for it to become famous. I think that's where we're able to sort of like nitpick and be like, oh, well, this is wrong and that's wrong. Whereas like I think he was just trying to write a story that he thought was interesting and that benefited him, but it ended up being this whole movement. And sort of watching it over the years has just been really interesting. I think I really like what you brought up in terms of celebration, because I agree. I think I'm obviously with, total decriminalization of drugs, and I think, Portugal did it right. Like, was it over 10 years ago now? And
Hmm.
I know the
I think it's
instances of
2000.
yeah, the instances of harm have really been reduced. I mean, the data is really stark and sort of reveals that that was the way to go, at least for them. So I think, that's sort of something I've been saying for a very, very long time. Um, yeah, I think this might be a little bit scary for people just hearing about this for the first time. Um, just because, right, I think in my head I keep getting sort of like a repeat of like, what about, people using drugs to escape or do you really think heroin is the good drug? And I just for some reason just like the flooding of the skeptics. Um, it's an interesting conversation, and I think that it needs to be, expanded even more. I think you did a really great job of sort of laying it all out, and you mentioned all of the different sectors and how different people, believe what different people believe, and how people are sort of helping or drawing the field forward. And I agree in terms of harm reduction that it's probably the most beneficial of them all, even though it's not a perfect system. Um, that's sort of the trajectory I've taken, right? So in my practice, whenever I prep and help, participants or clients prep or integrate their psychedelic experiences, it's usually from a lens of harm reduction. Just because the way I think about it is that they're already going in with such like an enthusiasm, right, to experience these medicines or these, plants or substances or whatever you want to call them or drugs. That the way I think about it is that they don't have to hold that space of like harm reduction. That's something that I should be holding. Like I feel like as, somebody who's a clinician or somebody who's even just holding space for that, we're supposed to be the ones to um, hold that space of like harm reduction, right? Like I also don't like the terminology, but it's for them to be able to have fun, right? It's almost like taking care of the safety portion so that you can have a good time, right? And so the way I think about it is like it's harm reduction, like harm, like possibility of harm reduction, rather than like there's necessarily going to be harm and then we're going to reduce that, right? So I think that's maybe a small distinction that I was thinking about. Um, Obviously, there's like so much more to say, but just for now, I think that's a pretty good segue into maybe a conversation to be had about this.
Totally cool. Yeah, I think we're pretty much on the same page with a lot of this stuff. I also wanted to just briefly mention, I'm going to hold it up for the video, but if you're just listening in audio, I'm holding a book called Drug Use for Grown-Ups by Dr. Carl Hart. And this book I read in last year, and it really genuinely changed my life because part of the reason why I think it's so powerful is because I think it really it challenges these designations that I think I'd been someone who kind of looked at psychedelics as being more positive and like, oh, something like meth is more dangerous. And really this book in particular kind of made me realize how, even though I thought I was beyond a lot of these stigmas, I actually was still carrying a lot of just very wrong-headed, very fact-free uh, prejudiced assumptions about drugs. And so that's made me, as part of the reason why I'm so fervent or enthusiastic now about breaking open some of these kinds of limited barriers, is because I think Carl Hart has really kind of kind of set the standard and the bar for really looking at this in a really phenomenal way. I just was skimming through the book, and I won't summarize it because I feel like that's going to make our conversation kind of stuck on this for a little bit too long. But I was noticing he begins the book with James Baldwin quote, which I really like, and it says, "If you want to get to the heart of the dope problem, legalize it. Prohibition is a law in operation that can only be used against the poor." And I just love that because I think it's kind of like that's when I'm thinking about this like politics and spirituality overlap. This is kind of one of those moments where I think that as people who experience psychedelics in a certain context, I think that I guess, I think there are a lot of gray areas, but I will say that I think a lot of people who are experiencing psychedelics don't have a lot of the same kinds of structural barriers or challenges to at least that experience that other drug users do. And I kind of feel like um, part of the reason why, for me, this kind of segue or shift to kind of looking at substances more generally is I just feel like if you really care, like if you actually really care, if these psychedelics made you feel like full of love for like your fellow human beings and want to help and all these things, to just kind of like sit back and relax at a certain point to me starts to feel really troubling. And it's like, well, if you care that much, then let's kind of think about how this could be expanded in a more substantial way. And I think that really going beyond the sort of the comfort of the psychedelic bubble, which I think it can be for certain people, of course it's not always been that way, but I think it's increasingly easier to identify, express, share this kind of psychedelic thing. And so I think it's kind of like, hey, like we could do better if and we can bring this to another level of recognition and transformation that, for me at least, is the intersectional angle with psychedelics. I think there are a lot of people who've been pushing at that, and that's wonderful. But I think that kind of pushing out of the psychedelic sort of bandwagon, I think is important. But I feel like I'm a little bit like rephrasing what I was saying before. So um, let's see. I know that part of the reason why I wanted to emphasize the drugs right now is I just feel like it's something that thematically I would love to come back to again and again, because I just feel like it's so critical and there's so much to be said about it. Um,
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to say. And Carl Hart is such an interesting person. I've met him briefly a few years ago at a Horizons
oh, no
conference,
way.
psychedelic conference. He actually had a speech about psychedelic exceptionalism, and I thought it was absolutely incredible. I mean, we all stood up and clapped, and it was just such truth coming out of his mouth that I even thought at some point he got a lot of sort of like crap for it. I think it was a little bit early, and I don't think people were ready for it, but I thought it was absolutely excellent. Because I think he was a department chair of Columbia at some point, or at Columbia,
I think he still
sorry.
is. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, there
yep,
was there
yep.
was something
I
where he
think
had
I think he
to
still has the same
leave.
position. Yeah. Oh, maybe he
Yeah,
had to the
he
position.
left, I
Interesting.
believe, for
Okay.
Switzerland and then came back, or I don't remember exactly what happened, but there was something about that. But yeah, but he's a really, really cool guy.
Again, psychedelics and kind of in the book where he's kind of looking at like the hippy dippy stuff with a little bit of like, yeah, this is not my world. And I was like, yeah, I mean, we all have our biases, and I think he's a little bit less embracing of the kind of like the spiritual, woo woo angle.
Hmm.
I know that's much more where I come from, and so I was like, wow, it's just interesting how we all come with a certain kind of set of, I don't know. Well, like, we're our own perspectives, and it was just interesting how for me that was kind of the weakest chapter, because I feel like it's not really, psychedelics are not really his strength, but in everything else he's just truly phenomenal. The reason why I wanted to discuss drugs in this episode, and we'll link it in the show notes, is the Young Turks, which is not something that I like particularly, and that would be a whole tangential thing. But they had a segment about benzodope, which is basically, I'm blanking on the xylazine mixed with fentanyl, and so basically
Mm.
fentanyl. If someone's having an overdose, you have Narcan, Naloxone. There are ways to prevent the overdose, but with xylazine, I think I'm saying it right. That doesn't work. So basically, it's another chapter of drug war propaganda, and I don't expect the Young Turks to be the most educated and informed on the issues, but it was just this kind of like just all this like yelling and basically, it got me kind of fired up to kind of focus on the drug issue, because it's they're basically like saying like the radical left harm reductionists, which I think is kind of a stretch no matter how you put it. It's just like it's a lot of like they're nominally left leaning or centrist. I'm not really sure how you think of the Young Turks. I don't really watch it very often, but it was just kind of reminding me of like this is generally how people are talking about this drug stuff, and it's so completely disconnected from reality. Yet that's kind of what I think a lot of people are saying. And again, I don't expect the better, but still just seeing they're just like really angry and yelling, but they don't really know anything about what they're saying, and they're just like, we should have more rehab, and they're basically arguing for coerced rehab. That's pretty much what they're saying. They're like, some people shouldn't have a choice. Some people should get off the streets. Like
Oof.
they're basically like they're nominally like wherever they think they are politically, the talking points that they're expressing are basically in favor of like coercive rehab and reinforcing all the same stigmatizing things and basically attacking the harm reductionists and saying those radical left harm reductionists are like causing the problem because they're enabling drug use. So it's like, okay, like this is, again, I didn't, and Anna Kasparian, who I think has some really great moments, she was definitely doubling down on that whole mindset. And so it just kind of got me thinking about drugs and made me think about this quote from The End of Drug Use for Grownups, where Carl Hart says, a regulated market with uniform quality standards would virtually put an end to contaminated drug consumption and greatly reduce fatal accidental drug overdoses. I wonder if facts should
Hmm.
play a role here. Of course, I have my own biases, but it's just like I think part of what really troubled me about the Young Turk segment is that what it disregards is that the reason why we have something as extreme as benzodope is because of the war on drugs, making it so that people can't get heroin anymore. So it's like it's been documented for decades that when you violently crack down on substance use, what happens is that people who are consuming look for, more intense, smaller quantities, easier to smuggle. That was true in prohibition. It's true with all the
Yeah.
drug trade right now. When you make it hard for someone to get something in a more mild, synthetic marijuana was exactly that, right? When you make it difficult for someone to get a more mild, safer, often more close to a plant version of something, well, what do people look for? They're looking for intenser highs that are easier to conceal because the threat of criminalization is what's driving that. And so it's kind of like when the Young Turks are talking, it's just like it's so disconnected from the fact that the reason why we have these really even fentanyl showing up to replace heroin is it's all part of the same cycle. And so Carl Hart talks about this, and I think it's just when you start to understand that, it's like, wow, it really makes a lot of sense, right? When you crack down on something, then from the user and the dealer perspective, you're encouraging people to intense smaller packages, because when you're trying to go and conceal something from the cops or law enforcement, when you're smuggling or carrying large amounts of drugs, the more intense version of it you have, the easier it is to conceal. And therefore, that's why you get extreme drugs. And as people, and that's where this is all coming from. So it's kind of like cracking down on benzodope is just going to make it even worse. Like it's just going to exacerbate the problem. And so it's kind of like the Young Turks are basically talking about things in a way they think they're on this kind of like moral high ground, but the way that I look at it is what they're doing is actually putting people in harm's way, because that kind of thinking is the exact opposite of what, as I understand it, is the actual logical and compassionate response. And so it kind of got me all fired up. The last thing I wanted to say about drugs, and we should probably shift to a different topic because I'm getting all agitated about this whole thing. Is just this is my colorful point that I was thinking about. What are rhetorical strategies that anyone listening could use? And I think that's something that I always work towards. Is like, what are really powerful examples or comparisons that can be made to convey some of this stuff that often is dry, takes a lot of reading. It's like you have to really spend a lot of time with these subjects to kind of get that level of nuance and context. How do you convey that to someone simply so that they understand it and they shift their view? And so I was thinking about like more, this is to do with addiction. I don't want to generalize completely, but just kind of an image that comes to mind for me is I feel like a lot of people are hurting, and drugs are often the only thing that's available to hurt a little bit less. And so to me, it's kind of like you're wounded. And so we can think about wounding in terms of trauma, primarily deprivation, all these things. That's a wound in your person. And the drug use is the bandage that you're able to apply to that wound. And then people who want to go and take that away are saying, we're trying to help you here. Let me rip that bandage off because I'm helping you. And I just feel like that to me is the violence of saying you're not allowed to take a substance, right? Because that's, I think, often how it is. And there's all these examples of people who do, are supervised, go to safe consumption sites, do heroin, and they have functional lives. Like, the idea that there's something incredibly horrible because you do a drug is to me really, really such a sick and mean spirited and totally lacks compassion, where it's kind of like, maybe that's the only thing that is working for you right now. Our society isn't exactly doing that great right now. And so that someone wants to escape, who am I to judge? I want to escape. Like, who doesn't want to escape right now? And if what you're turning to is benzodope, that's really terrible. But for us to condemn the desire to leave a bad situation is essentially the same argument as saying you should stay in an abusive relationship. You should stay in a job that is making is where you're being, targeted or attacked, or you should stay in an environment that is horrible for you. No, you should leave. And so, if the only way you can leave is by taking a substance that has a lot of risks associated with it, well, you're just doing the best thing that you can do. That's the bandage available. And I think to not recognize that the issue is that we don't have a better bandage available, that's the real issue, rather than basically attacking the victim of the situation, which is, I feel like, what a lot of people end up doing, whether it's the Young Turks or any kind of other, attacking drug users, stigmatizing, all kinds of language along those lines. And I think that's kind of that's the final point that I wanted to make. Anyway, drugs, 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 drugs. Is there a segue?
Um,
There's another thing that we were going to discuss in this episode. Is there a segue from
yeah.
drugs and drug use to the
Well,
stuff that we were going to cover?
well, that's the thing, right? I think we should maybe just like stick to what we're where we're going for now, and then we can segue into it. Because I just got like a lot of ideas when you were saying that, and even before you mentioned the examples, I was thinking about how the U.S. government almost like serves as like parental control to people, which is kind of ridiculous if you think about sort of like the imagery we can sort of like conjure when thinking about like crackdowns and things like that. It's like, if your child is, like hiding and eating chocolate, like does like if you like ban them from having that, doesn't mean they're not going to do it. They're just not going to trust you. And so I think that's like the biggest issue. And even so, that's totally not restricted to drugs. Like this is a relationship that we have with the government that is so toxic. Like I don't even want to talk about the government just because there's so much wrong there, and this could be like a whole other topic. But that's the thing, right? I think the sort of one thing that I wanted to add in terms of like what would be helpful to the listeners is, be just it's hard, right? Because you want to tell people to not trust, random sources, but then again, if the US government is telling us that like this drug is good versus and this drug is bad, right? Because depending on like scheduling, right? So like psychedelics are schedule 1, ketamine schedule 3, and like, alcohol and caffeine are not even scheduled. So it's like you can't even trust that. You can't even trust certain publications coming out because of like who is funding them, right? Like we don't know who's funding what research. So I definitely know that there are some like research. Obviously I was in research for a long time, so I do agree that research data is very important, and it depends who's sort of overseeing it and everything. But then at the same time you have all of this hypocrisy. I've also had so many sort of psychedelic experiences with alcohol and caffeine, and that's why I can't consume caffeine on a daily basis because I've had full transformative experiences and just something even more intense than I've even had on a psychedelic. So it's like it doesn't make any sense, and this is where I think we need to come back to, discernment and bodily autonomy and really just trusting your inner gut and almost like being your own guru, right? Like that's something that I always sort of advocate for in terms of my business. I'm always like, you're the one who has the answers. I don't have the answers. I'm only facilitating for you. I'm only holding space for you. I'm only showing you what you don't see. I'm only giving you a language. Um, and this is probably where we can segue into the other thing, but basically it's like you are the one who has all of the like yourself best, right? Like you're supposed to be the one with all the sovereignty. And so I think just connecting back to our bodies, connecting back to ourselves and our feelings, and sort of giving room to all of these things will help us understand um, after going through the grief of like, wow, these people lied to me my whole life. I feel like we all go into it. Like once we have an awakening, we start to kind of get really sad and realize like, wow, I've been lied to my whole life. But then after that, you get really empowered. And so I'm just trying to give people a roadmap to like where you end up going. Because that's the thing, right? Like, you can't really trust anyone but yourself. And not to say that you can't trust the communities around you, but sometimes people are misinformed. They think they're helping you when they're not. So it's really, really, really important to just try to look inward a little bit and yeah, try to sort of pick out that intuition, try to trust that because it won't lead you astray, right? Like
Mm.
you probably if you use drugs, you probably know that there's something wrong that not use like I'm sorry, let me rephrase this. Not It's not the doing drugs that's wrong, it's the something's wrong, there's a need that's not being fulfilled, and so that's why you use it. And so I understand a lot of shame comes with that, and I think this is something that we need to talk about to sort of dismantle in our societies because that's what's kept us asleep, or that's what's kept us quiet, or that's what's kept us sort of in places that are easy to sort of control, right? And so yeah, if I can give anybody advice, it's to really just get to know yourself on a deeper level and you will have all of the answers.
I definitely concur with that. The one thing that you said that just jumped into my mind, I was trying to go in and find the actual document, but I think it's on my other computer. I was looking at the DEA website about MDMA, and it was talking about how people abuse MDMA, and then it talked about some of the effects of MDMA, and it was like pleasurable feelings in the body, like feelings of love and connection, feelings of unity or whatever. It kind of had a little short list of the things that MDMA actually does, and then it's like on the other side of the same page, it's like this is abuse. You're abuse, and I looked at the definition of abuse, and it's just like on no planet is that the product of a sane mind to me, or I guess this planet is actually exactly where that's happening, but it's not. It's just it's so deranged where it's kind of like on one side of the page it's like this is defined as abuse and abusive, and like that's a very we know we have these associations with abuse and what that means, which I think is important. And on the other side of the page it's talking about these really awesome things like having more pleasure in touching, and that feels good. Like, so it's kind of like, I think that was also when I was thinking about the drug celebration paradigm and kind of thinking about why for me that's so important. It's like what we're being presented with is such a complete mismatch, right? Like on the one side of the page, the DEA, and it's just because the DEA is like the most extreme case of the schism, because they're the ones responsible for enforcing these policies. On the
Yeah.
one side, it says this is abuse, and on the other side, it's like feeling good in your body. So what's really being said there, in a sense, and of course, I'm taking some poetic license here, is saying abuse and feeling good in your body is the same thing because that's how it's being defined, which I think is wow. I mean, what is that? I mean, to me, that really kind of just is like, let's get a little deep here and think about Western civil. I mean, it opens up so many things from, how we relate to our bodies and Christianity and rationalism. I mean, it just opens up just like a Pandora's box of many, critiques that I think often we're now familiar with around the society in which we live. But just for me, it was just such a striking when we think about this meaning here. Abuse is functionally being defined as experiencing pleasure and feeling good in your body. And to me, that just really embodied the entire like, well then how do we use words in a way that is responsible? Because to me, that's the epitome of contradiction right there. That's like what could be further from abuse is to feel good and safe and loved and to hug yourself or someone else. Like that's the antithesis of abuse, yet we're being asked to believe that by this document that is created by this immensely powerful and potentially very violent, or is, but not always, agency that has the capacity to exercise incredible force, and that language being so fundamental to how this is all working for me is just really intriguing and really amazing, and partially why defining terms and language is something that I just come back to again and again and again. I feel there's so much when we ask ourselves questions about what do these words mean? What do they
Yeah.
mean? How do we define these words?
Yeah,
So on
semantics are
that note,
so important.
such a big one. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
On that note, we wanted to talk about free will, determinism, and fate. We are definitely kind of running up to length limits, so I think maybe it'll be a shorter conversation. But I would love to segue and kind of just start to open up a little bit around the stuff we talked about covering our other topic for the episode.
Yeah, I guess I could segue super easily because I mean everything we talked about just to sort of like summarize is almost like using shame in order to oppress, right? And so there's this theme or this sort of like this cycle of sort of distancing ourselves from our bodies and from our knowing and from sort of like uh being able to um like be autonomous by like farming our own food or things like that. So I think there's been almost like this 100 to 1,000 year period where we've sort of been being pulled apart slowly, 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 so that we don't notice. Because I think the biggest one I can think of is sort of the lunar calendar, right? So moving away from the lunar calendar, and going into like a Gregorian calendar, which doesn't match the cyclical nature of sort of our world and our universe, right? So it's just pulling us away from our own human nature. And that's kind of where the whole, astrology topic came in for me. I wanted to talk about sort of the calendar, but then also about determinism or, the difference between determinism and free will, right? So I think there's this big narrative, uh, in today's society of like, we have free will, and this is something that we need to sort of hold really close, and determinism is bad, and like that's fine, but it's just a matter of this is something that has really developed over the past thousands of years, and I think astrology is kind of like a threat to free will in a sense, or I think that's what people believe, because every time I end up sort of introducing astrology to someone or talking about it, this is a topic that I always end up sort of faced with, right? Because I think the biggest threat to people's autonomy or what they think is autonomy is, having a piece of paper or a chart that says this is exactly what's going to happen to you in your lifetime. And I think, I don't even know, honestly, if we're going to be able to cover all of it today, just because it's such a big topic. But I just wanted to say that that's not the way I think about it. I think about it in a sense that there are only archetypal structures that are sort of fixed, in a sense where, something may come up, and you can decide how it ends up playing out, right? So let's say, I'm trying to think of an example. Let's say, right, let's do something current. So Saturn has entered Pisces, right? And you can take that in a very literal sense and say, okay, during the next 3 years, there are going to be lots of floodings. There are going to be, there's going to be a lot of importance put on water issues, right? There's going to be a scarcity of water. Um, and those are very literal meanings, right? Literal predictions. Whereas, like, it could also be that, um, this mysticism is going to be introduced into our society and set as a structure. Psychedelics can become, part of the institution, part of medicine, right? So it's almost like you can pull so many different meanings from just two simple words that you say, the planet and what the sign is. And it's kind of like, the mythology, in the sense that you're pulling meaning from the gods or the goddesses. So let's say, like, Venus in Roman mythology, or Aphrodite, or sorry, in Greek mythology, and Aphrodite in Roman mythology. That's the goddess of like beauty and love and peace, and you can derive all of these different meanings, all of these different sort of like adjectives from just saying Venus or Aphrodite, right? Like the thought comes in, and it's just like, wow, there are all these words that can describe it, whereas like it's not necessarily one specific thing. And you also have, oh my gosh, sorry, it's such a big topic. um
Hmm.
yeah, and it just, there's so many ways that you can sort of play with the different meanings, even though the archetype is sort of set in stone in a way. So I think, just personally, I try to I try to think about things in several different ways, where it's like things don't have to be one way or another, and they can be both. And this is one of those things which can be both, right? It could be fixed, and free will and determinism can coexist without one of them being threatening to autonomy.
Totally. Yeah, no, I was actually just thinking about like, is there a segue here? Because I feel like we kind of, we had wanted to cover a couple of different subjects, and the drug thing, there's so much to say that I feel like it was almost kind of like, should we just talk about drugs for the whole episode, or kind of go with
We
the
could
game plan?
have.
And I actually think, I think it's good that we I think we were kind of learning how to structure the conversations in the way that feels both organic and natural, but also has direction to it. And I feel like. I'm glad we did this because I feel like I was like, what is the connection here? And I feel like thematically, and I think this is also coming back to like, what does it feel like to be alive today? And that's something that I've really been enjoying getting deeper and deeper into. Is like just trusting myself as if, let's say it's true, let's just say it's true that our minds are interconnected, right? Then
Mhm.
how I'm feeling about the world has a tangibility that I wouldn't have granted it before when I was much more in a materialist paradigm, which would have said, okay, fine, like I have a psychology and a psyche and a mind, and sure, I have an unconscious and whatever categories we're using, but I wouldn't necessarily have said, well, my feeling like this right now about the world, I would have acknowledged it, but ultimately dismissed it, right? And I think now it's a bit more like, no, I want to actually act as if the way that I'm feeling about the world is a bit more of like that radio transmitter. It's a tired old image, but it's one that comes up all the time where it's like, no, maybe I am kind of like absorbing something that tells me something real. But what is it like? We're here in March 2023. Now it's happening, and how can I feel into the way the world exists and to trust that impulse? And I feel like the trusting and the increase are interrelated. And so the segue that I'm seeing here is, I feel like with the drug thing, it's kind of like we have a system of delineations and labels and definitions that are just not working. And for me, reimagining how we relate to substances in a vocabulary that makes sense for the society that we live in is really important. And kind of in a similar way, what you're talking about is that people are sometimes bringing. So for me, I feel like maybe because I grew up in a bit more of like a secular, science dominant kind of, that felt the hegemony to me. Determinism has often been the thing that I rail against. And so I've spent a lot of time in rooms with people who believe that determinism is literally true. I've read a lot of writing by people who would definitely argue that free will doesn't exist, or at least those are the kinds of sources that I've contended with. And so for me, I feel like I'm kind of looking at it from the other side of things, where I feel like the overwhelming belief in determinism makes me want to fight for a belief in free will, even though getting caught up in that debate, I feel like to me, is just often feels really counterproductive. But I think kind of coming back to what you're talking about, I feel like what we're both, I think, recognizing is that these labels don't work. But what's there instead? What's there instead has to be a bit more dynamic, a bit more responsive to the situation. And I think it's an ongoing mystery. And so for me as a tarot reader, I ask myself a lot of the questions that are very similar. It's kind of like, is a reading that I give to someone, is that revealing something that was always going to happen and that's more deterministic? Or is the reading actually implanting certain images into that person's psyche, if they accept those images as guidance, that is then creating the world that they will live in the future, in which case it's not deterministic at all. The tarot is not an oracular system so much as it's defining and shaping the future, because it's sort of more like a placebo effect thing, where you're taking in these images and then using that as a basis for your beliefs. And the extent to which you buy into it, so to speak, is the extent to which you're going to shape your future on the basis of that reading. And so when I think about it that way, it puts a lot of pressure on me as a reader to like, oh my God, I don't want to say something or misinterpret
Right.
the cards in a way that is destructive. And I think that's true for anyone who works with these kinds of systems. I'm sure you ask yourself that as an astrologer. It's kind of like, if we say things, if we are being prescriptive and shaping someone's experience through what we say, that puts a lot of pressure on us to get it right, or not say things that are going to be accidentally harmful or cause some kind of disruption down the road. But at the same time, we have to go and share things that are what we're actually seeing, and not sugarcoat things. So I think it's constantly this kind of negotiation, which I think is really
Right.
interesting, because it's touching upon this kind of back and forth of like, are the cards or the astrology or whatever system you're using to make sense of your make meaning out of your experience, is that saying something that was just gonna happen, or are you inventing the future? And I think we both probably agree on this, that the reality is that it's not really one or the other, right? It's somewhere in the
Yeah.
middle. and that's why it's always a question. You can't stop asking the question because I don't think that it's completely prescriptive. Like I don't think that I think there are things that are beyond us and patterns that I don't know have a larger role to play than we do in our lives that go beyond, there are limits. The same time, I don't think everything is set in stone. And so many of the things that I read really reinforce the idea that we are making our own lives. And to feel empowered and have that sense of empowerment to a certain extent relies upon the belief that you can make a change, that you're not helpless, you're not a victim of circumstance, and that maybe your power is not infinite, but it exists. And that's kind of,
Yeah.
Mitch Horowitz, who's one of my heroes, when he's writing about The Secret and mind matter metaphysics and positive thinking, always emphasizes this at the end of One Simple Idea, which is a few books ago when he kind of summarizes New Thought, which is something that I always love to weave into every conversation to an extent. He basically says, look, like it's not the only power in the universe, but it is a power, right? So it's kind of like, and how powerful that is it really depends. I don't know. I would like to leave it open ended, but the point being that our thoughts do influence reality. The question is not do they, but how much. And I think that's a conversation that we can't and that doesn't end. That's kind of like that's more the infinite conversation that I would love to work towards, where it's like it's proportion, right? I think we know that our thoughts do make a difference. How much of a difference do they make is the thing we'll be asking and have been asking, I think, for the longest time. And these kind of divination systems, I think, speak to it. I don't know, I guess, but I
Yeah.
think there's something about positioning this kind of like free will versus determinism. It's kind of one of these very common philosophical debates. And so I was kind of wanting to kind of stay focused on that question because it's so easy to get pulled into all these really interesting directions. From what I said, I kind of feel like how does that fit into the free will determinism kind of like spectrum? And I guess are we on the same page as far as like it's a combination of both, but like how is that not just a dead end of conversation basically?
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot to say, as you mentioned. I think it ties it in really well because I think it's important to look at where we are in life at the current moment and realizing that it's like you said, these things don't work and we need the words that are dynamic and right. Even there's even this I read somewhere that the only English is the only language that uses like spell work, which is basically like spelling, like magic. And so, I feel like this kind of goes into the whole you create your reality with your words. That's why it's important to speak things out. And so I think I don't know what the percentage is, but there's definitely a mix between, things that may be determined and then things that you can change. I think it's almost the way I see it is like the person who is fully in control is our higher self, which is basically us, just in a different sort of state of mind, a sort of more all-seeing state. Whereas the incarnation that we chose to embody doesn't have the full story, and so part of the fun is being able to have free will and make certain choices, but then um, just sort of like go to these stopping points, almost like a video game, right? Where it's like you're allowed to go all these different places, but you know that if you get a certain amount of points, you get to upgrade to the next level. So it's kind of like that, going, from one world to the other, but then having freedom in exploring where you are, and then having certain points in life that you predetermined. Like it's not even just predetermined that somebody did it for you. Like I believe that we sort of like put these little clues for ourselves in certain lifetimes so that I'm like I want to awaken at this point and I want to meet this person at this point, and like whatever I do in between is just going to be completely freeform. So that's how I see it. And so whenever I do readings, I think it's really important. What I usually do is I give options, right? I give optionality, so it's not even just like this is going to happen to you. It's more like this may happen, or this may happen, or this may happen. It's basically a choose your own adventure, which also, like you said, puts so much sort of pressure on the reader, right? Because it's almost like we have a responsibility to almost like, not see things from our perspective, but almost be like a blank canvas to sort of channel purity and love. And that's kind of why before every reading, I'll sort of have a bit of a ritual to sort of cleanse. my body and my vessel in order to sort of be able to channel from a place of love, and in order to channel like my highest self, or a person's guides or my guides or somebody who is from the light, right? So in order for it to not be harmful and for it to be as constructive as possible. And so I think that's the where the importance comes from. And if one of the guys decides like this person needs to know this thing, then you tell them. But this is sort of the way I structure and the way I think about it. And I think that's a pretty good like, I think the comparison with like the video game is kind of easier for people to grasp in that way.
Totally. We should definitely do an episode about the simulation
Yeah.
hypothesis. I have a lot of feelings about it, and
Yeah.
I do not. I don't think. Okay, I'll just give away the punchline now because I think it's whatever. There's a lot to be said, but pretty much I feel like it's one way. It's a language. What am I trying to say? It's like one way of talking about something that I think is there, but I think the way it's being talked about is disappointing. So
Mm.
and I feel like it's kind of like a little bit like there has to be some kind of an image
Mhm.
because for some reason we need an image to access this kind of understanding about the cosmetic process. But which image we choose says a lot about what will happen because there is a deviation and a shift based on the kinds of images that we pick when we're interacting with these kinds of ideas. So that's kind of like the very short version of my 2 cents about the simulation conversation, the video game comparisons. But what I think is more relevant to this conversation, what you were talking about, and what it made me think about is Mitch Horowitz uses the word selecting. So instead of manifesting, and I really like that. It's kind of like when you said optionality, I think that's kind of like what triggered it in my mind. I feel like it's the same thing of kind of like having a word. For me, I've been thinking of intention. Intention, I feel like as I think about like what word do I choose, intention is kind of I think the one that I'm leaning towards as like that's the one that does it for me. Like intention has roots in my past and is something that comes up in the Seth material, which I feel like I basically have this kind of like dream to be a teacher of the Seth material, and so it's kind of we all have our pie in the sky, and Marianne Williamson, sort of in the footsteps of Marianne Williamson, because she came into her own as a teacher of oh my god, it's going to be embarrassing, I'm going to forget the what is it called, the miracle. You know what I'm talking
I
about.
I I
This is
think
my
I
big.
saw, but I'm not as versed as you are in her stuff.
Oh boy. Anyway, this is
It's okay.
the beauty of off the cuff statements. Anyway, Marianne Williamson is really known for I can even remember it's like Helen Schuckman is the person who channeled it. It's from the 1970s. Anyway, it's kind of the text that launched Marianne Williamson into the public eye. And so for me, when I'm looking
Mm.
at the South material, I'm kind of in that vein. Again, who knows where it'll go? I'm just kind of like at the very beginning of really kind of taking it on as a philosophy that I feel like is really helpful and has a lot of general application. Anyway, little tangent to come back to echoing what you were saying, which is that in the Seth material, sort of a similar idea to the higher mind and this incarnation. And it's again one of those things where I feel like to anyone listening, I feel like it's been really I would encourage allowing the possibility of what happens if I just let this be how I conceive of the world. Because I've been having some really amazing effects in my own life of pulling away the glass, so to speak. And it's kind of like, okay, I've been familiar with this idea for, I mean, a really long time, but have I really been living my life as if this is actually the case? And giving that a chance is something that I realize I really haven't done a huge amount of, especially when it's kind of like sort of what you said, choose your own adventure, and kind of like doing it in a very kind of just like one little bit at a time. And so in the Seth material, um, our individual personalities are one piece of the entity, which is the word
Mhm.
that Seth uses, higher mind,
Right.
which is basically a composite of all these different parallel lifetimes and identities. And so it's
Yep.
kind of like I am one branch of a tree, or I'm,
Hmm.
one satellite of a central sun or whatever. It's kind of, there's a lot of different images, or I'm one cloud in a cloud formation, or I'm sure there's all kinds of, I mean, again, speaking of images, we could go all over. I'm like one bird in a flock of birds, or one
Hmm.
star in the sky among many stars, or and I think the poetic imagery could just go infinitely. But basically, that our specific identities right now are, as you were saying, one piece or part of this larger order of being, which is what Seth calls an entity, which is sort of like the accumulation of all these different lives that for Seth, there is no such thing as linear time. So
Yep.
every single one of our incarnations is happening at the same time, all being a part of this larger higher mind, which is this entity that is ourself in a different order of being. And just kind of like sitting with that is like, whoa, that's pretty crazy. So and then it's kind of like the biggest shift has just been like, okay, so when I think about it that way, then I've always been a fan of kind of like the ancient mystery schools, and like Alexandria and Egypt, and
Mhm.
like the Hellenistic kind of classical world, and like that was a time where magic was a real part of the world in a way that it really hasn't been since then. And I'm kind of like, that's now. Whoa, like that's now. That's now. Now and then are the same place or the same time. There's a certain kind of like, suddenly it doesn't feel so far away. And just having that experience has been really kind of cool. So it's just like one little example of like when I start to really try to allow that sense of total eternal presence of multiple beings being individual petals on the flower of this larger composite identity, which is called an entity or a higher mind. If I allow that idea to just sort of like seep into the way that I'm experiencing my life, some really cool stuff is happening. And so it's like, whether it's literally true or not, at a certain point, it's like, well, I don't even care. I mean, I do care, but like, it's just like seeing the mind expanding potential that I've already noticed in my own life, just coming from getting a little closer to these things that I've tried to be very academic and scholarly about over all these years, because I didn't want to come off as overly biased, or I wanted to kind of be able to make a neutral case or whatever it is that I wanted to be able to speak from a very neutral position. Now I'm like, maybe that wasn't the right approach, and really seeing some very amazing things happening from letting it a little bit closer.
Yeah, totally, totally. And I think if this is, if the whole concept of higher mind or higher self is a little bit too, far-fetched for any of our listeners, I mean, if you've ever experienced a time where you've maybe had an out-of-body experience or sleep paralysis or something like that, you can imagine that even though you feel like maybe you don't have a choice, right? You're kind of stuck. You kind of always do, but not maybe in this realm, right? Because it's like this life wouldn't be as fun, I think, if we knew everything, right? Like, what would be the point of actually seeking or anything like that? I mean, I actually had an experience where I had sleep paralysis 2 days ago, where I literally could not move. And in my mind, in like the human rational mind, we always think like, I have free will, I have choice, I can, do anything I want. But then in those 5 to 10 seconds, I couldn't move, and I kept trying, like I kept willing my mind and my body to move, and I'm like, move, move, and it just wouldn't happen, even though I knew I was in control somewhere else. This sort of gives us a glimpse into the workings of the other dimensions in which we also exist. It's just a matter of um, humbling ourselves in a way where it's like, okay, maybe I don't have full control all the time here and now, even though I will do the best with the choices that I am given. So, yeah.
Hmm. It makes me think of you maybe have heard this phrase, but it's called the drought of forgetfulness, which is kind of like, and I just love that as like a way of describing it. But it's kind of the idea that of course this presumes reincarnation, which I think at this point we're clearly on the favorable side towards. Um, but basically the drought of forgetfulness is like, before you come into the earthly life,
Mhm.
you drink this, almost feels like you're drinking a goblet full of like some potion that will make you forget everything, so you
Yeah, yeah.
start anew without having any awareness, and you have that gradual rediscovery. And there's just something at first, And especially when I was younger, it was just like, wow, that's so terrible. That sucks. Because what about all the things that are terrible they're going to happen because you're into blah blah. Like this is kind of a saw more the negative aspect of like not having the information that would allow you to become more aware of what's going on in your life and not having a philosophy that helps orient you in the world. And now I just kind of see it in a much more, maybe a more positive way. It maybe not completely positive, but more like seeing the other side, so that maybe the ultimate kind of outcome is a more balanced view, where it's kind of like, but isn't it so beautiful? Because, and that's also kind of shifted my view sometimes of, I see people who have just these really odious or hateful views, or people who just were really, really resistant to an idea that I think is just so self-evident, and people are just very stuck in their ways. And I think sometime maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, I finally started saying, hey, hold on a second. I know for me, I was able to have certain really dark, nihilistic, morbid sort of like experiences as like a depressed high school student that I can't have anymore. And that happened because I didn't have the belief system and the awareness that I do now. So not having access to certain things was what let me have certain experiences. And some of
Mm,
those are really valuable. And I'm like, isn't it? It's kind of great what happens when you don't know things, but it's also can be really dangerous, and you can get yourself, I think, in a lot of situations that are really potentially very damaging. That being said, there is something about what's possible when you don't know that I was able to finally recognize as having a value that I didn't credit it with before. So drought of forgetfulness, my favorite description for
that's
forgetting all this
great.
stuff and
That's
rediscovering
great.
it.
Awesome. Yeah, it's similar to the veil of forgetfulness that I know, or the Rainbow Bridge, sort of galactic from galactic terms. But yeah, it's all the same. I think you're right. It's really helped in having formative experiences that we wouldn't have been able to have, and these are sort of experiences that were necessary in order to become the people we are now today, or today. Um, yeah, it's great.
Cool. I feel like this is a natural stopping point. Do we have any other last things to throw in, or should we wind down and call it an episode?
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of different topics. I'm curious to hear from listeners if there's anything that you'd like us to talk about or something you'd like us to expand upon, because I feel like we brought up several things, but then either, cut them short because of time or decided to explore some other topics that we were thinking about. So if there's anything that's particularly interesting to you, we'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. Yeah, I completely echo that. I would really love to hear any feedback or any things that come to mind from hearing this episode or the ones before. Definitely for me, I feel like a big part of this in the long run is just, bringing people together and converging, having a conversation. I think that in the best case scenario, my kind of like idealistic vision for what we're doing here is, we're not talking about things that people don't already talk about, right? And I think there's nothing particularly novel about, well, maybe there is sometimes, think like the drug celebration paradigm. I think that's kind of novel, or it's like a synthesis of things in a new way or whatever. So, I don't want to downplay the extent to which maybe some genuinely new ideas or approaches can come out of this, but I think that primarily it's the kind of conversation that we're having. And I think that's really something that I've really spent, pretty much my whole life working towards. And a lot of what really motivates this podcast is feeling like the kind of conversation that we're having could be better and could be different, and that we can have a space that allows for a certain kind of range of discussion that I just don't see happening in a lot of other places, which is, compassionate, it's thoughtful, it's listening, it's inclusive, it's allowing for a lot of different kinds of perspectives to be listened to and respected in a way that I think oftentimes doesn't happen. And then also trying to steer clear of inadvertently platforming or enabling something that I think we can agree is very destructive. Like, there do need to be guardrails, but in general, I feel like there's so much room for focusing on things in a much more positive and supportive way. And let's see, if it takes me too long to find this, I will skip reading it. But there's a
Yeah.
quote from Wallace D. Wattles, I believe, which is one of the New Thought pioneers, and I think the book is from 1911. And I am gonna try to find this as quickly as possible, but I'm concerned I don't want to have a
Yeah, and
awkward
in the
pause here.
meantime, if anybody is looking for how to reach us, you can either reach us on the Crystal Tablet account on Instagram or comment on Spotify. I believe I don't know if you can do that, or I think Apple Podcasts you can leave a comment. Um, but yeah, otherwise, if we have an email, we can put it in the show notes. But yeah, we'll make it easily accessible to you.
Okay, it's going to take me too long to find this quote, so I'll kind of verbatim sort of kind of try to outline it. But basically, it's pretty much saying that it's exhorting us to focus on people's virtues, and instead of seeing people as in this very kind of negative light, see people as aspiring, as reaching towards their best selves. I think the exact language and wording is could be a lot of things, but in general, it's kind of like encouraging us to see each other in the best possible light, and just to kind of grant that a chance to exist. It doesn't mean that it's categorical and can't be, things can happen to make us maybe not have that perspective, but kind of like beginning, encouraging, looking to, seeking to see like the virtuous in everyone, which I feel like in today's day and age, to say looking for the virtue in everyone can feel a little tacky or kind of like awkward. Then there's something there as far as like trying to kind of see the aspirational, and see people as trying to get better and growing, and just kind of focus there. Because if we're going to say that, whatever the phrase is, I mean, it's really pithy, but I'm not thinking about it right now. But it's kind of like, where things flow, where your attention goes, or there's some kind of like the rhymey version of it, where it's basically saying, what you look at, where you put your attention has a lot of significance. And I think that it's like, well, if I'm accepting that, then, well, the best thing that I can do is really focus on seeing the best in people, and encouraging that to exist in the way that we're having a conversation. So I really hope that we can do that in this conversation in the future, when we have guests on the show, in the conversations that I hope come from this in the future. And I really want to encourage everyone to kind of try to find that in how we debate, especially difficult issues, and really hope to see a place where more of that can happen, and to attract and encourage people who want to go there, to have a place to just like, let's do it. I think that's kind of that's like the dream vision of Crystal Tablet, kind of as it expands to be that kind of a feeling. I don't know, I think a feeling is the best way to put it. So that's all from me. Thank you so much for listening. And then Leila, do you want to close us out?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, if you wanted like a slightly simplified version to that, if you were anything like me, you would treat others like they were a child and don't really know any better, and have innocent intentions, and give them the benefit of the doubt. So, and with that, we leave you and wishing you a great day wherever you are.